Honorable Minister Cozier Frederick, Minister of Environment, Rural Modernization and Kalinago Upliftment of the Commonwealth of Dominica, representatives of partner agencies and organizations, esteemed country representatives present in the room and virtually, good morning again, and welcome to the second day of our sub-regional event on NDC implementation, brought to you by UNDP's Climate Promise in collaboration with the government of Antigua and Barbuda. We had a very successful day yesterday, and just to recap, we looked at some of the key elements to be considered in leveraging the NDCs to achieve energy security in the Caribbean. We heard from ILO on the tools that they are rolling out, such as their green job assessments, upskilling of the workforce, and tripartite conversations as it relates to ensuring the just transition of the workforce, ascertaining that the citizens are skilled to participate in the job market as the countries transition from fossil fuels. We also heard from the government of Antigua on its energy targets and the process of setting those targets and some ideas as how they will implement and achieve such. We also heard of their soft fund and the process that it took to develop the soft fund and the inclusion of youth and gender there as well. We also heard from the CCRI, who highlighted the need for enabling an environment that would foster energy transition and uptake of the right mix of energy in the Caribbean, as well as the availability of financing to undertake and roll out such energy mixes. Our colleague from IRENA, who joined us online, highlighted the support provided to the region, such as the CIP, which also extends support to private sector to ensure that they are not left behind in the transition process. Moving on to session 2, we looked at the data needs and gaps that hinders NDC implementation and the accuracy of setting targets in the region. I think we can all agree that the consensus here was defining what the data needs are, how it needs to be collected, stored, and disseminated, and that data availability remains one of the main constraints in the region. And we did hear as well from the CDB of some promising initiatives such as the regional MRV that will benefit Caribbean SIDS and address some of these issues. In session 3 on mobilizing sustainable financial resources, again, we heard from partners on initiatives deployed to assist countries in the region to attract external financing, as well as internal funding for NDC implementation, such as climate budget tagging and de-risking of the environmental loans in some cases. Today, we will shift our focus a bit to some of the cross-cutting issues related to effective NDC implementation and also invite partners to share on the readily available support that countries can access to implement their NDCs. So with that, I would like to move directly into session 1. We have a really short day today, just 2 sessions, and we intend to finish at 1 p.m. So our first session today looks at examining emerging and cross-cutting areas of importance towards NDC implementation, and it will be moderated by Ms. Misha Clark, Gender Specialist in the UNDP Barbados and the OECS office. Our panelists today are on this first session. So we have Dr. Mark Bino, Assistant Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Ms. Nyasha Hamilton, Environmental Specialist within the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning and Information Technology, Honorable Cozier Frederick, Minister for Environment, Rural Modernization and Kalinago Upliftment from the Commonwealth of Dominica, and Mr. Elijah James, National Coordinator in Antigua and Barbuda of the CYEN Caribbean Youth Environment Network, So if I may ask all the panelists to just make their way to the left of the lectern on stage so we can get started. Thank you.
So thank you, Annalyn. And I guess, yes, the mic is working well. For the recap of yesterday's proceedings, I believe it's really a perfect segue as we discussed a number of important issues yesterday. And it lends very well into the opening of this morning's session, which looks again, just to reiterate at the topic, examining emerging and cross-cutting areas of critical importance towards NDC implementation. And good morning again, colleagues. As Alan Ling would have mentioned, my name is Misha Clark, and I currently serve as the Technical Specialist for Gender Equality on board the Engender Project in the UNDP MCO. And I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this morning's panel. Joining me is an esteemed grouping of panelists. We have none other than the Honorable Minister of Environment, Rural Modernization, and Canaligo Upliftment, the Honorable Mr. Cozier Frederick. We also have with us the Assistant Executive Director of the Caribbean Climate Change Center, Dr. Mark Bino. We also have with us the Environmental Specialist, Ms. Nyasha Hamilton with the Ministry of Finance, Economic Planning, and Information Technology in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And last, but by no means least, we are also joined with Mr. Elijah James, the Youth Coordinator for Antigua and Barbados of the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. And I should note, colleagues, that as gender is a critical area for the facilitators and myself in our portfolio, there were attempts made to have other female participants to be on the panel, but unfortunately, she wasn't able to make the conference proceedings. So just so we note that we did have our gender balance was within the panel. We tried very hard. So without any further delay, I want to get right into the first session, and I would like each panelist to briefly share their insights and work on the presentation topic, that was at hand, and you have 2 minutes to do so in answering. I'm going to start with the Honorable Minister for Dominica, Minister Cozier. We heard a lot yesterday about the involvement of the community and specifically what came up was the knowledge of Indigenous persons. Can you share in 2 minutes a little bit of your work that you've done in terms of the Caganalo community within Dominica and why their involvement was so critical in terms of NDC implementation?
And thank you so much for the invite to be part of this wonderful panel today. And just to say, the very existence of an indigenous people within the Caribbean space or the Caribbean civilization speaks to resilience. Because I have argued many times, and the ancestors would have fought a major battle or major battles in attempting to deflect an invasion. And so climate change actually happened when that invasion started. And when our forests were cut down, when our resources were extracted, and with no consideration for an existing population, to the end where we have, to a certain extent, a near extinction of our first people who populated the entire region. And so my existence as a descendant of the Karinago people is one that speaks to our resilience. We have been able to survive harsh weather conditions, genocide, disease for thousands of years. And so within the constructs of governance within Dominica itself, it's not by chance that the Ministry of Environment is also linked with the indigenous community. And so serving as the minister, I have the opportunity, the distinct opportunity to bring to the table aspects of our heritage that have been discounted from the conversation for a very long time. And to reiterate and to proclaim that there are practices within indigenous communities that we can look toward as we develop our national strategies. And so we have been able on the island to integrate a number of strategies, a number of age-old heritage pieces that have been able to assist us to survive. And so we speak to the architecture of our landscape, our designs of homes. We speak to how we treat modern nature. And it's a fact that nature don't need people to survive. But we need it. We need to clothe ourselves, to build our homes, to build enterprises. And so the model that we're using on the island is to ensure that we take into consideration the significant aspects of the Kalagwe heritage that have survived. And when we juxtapose all of these practices against other indigenous peoples around the world, we realize that we share a common thread, that we all treat Mother Nature with respect. We all treat Mother Nature with a level of humility. We accept our condition and our space, but we also know that if we do not protect nature, we run the risk of what's happening today. And in the context of Dominica, we have in the last 5 years been affected by two major disasters: Hurricane Maria in 2017, and Tropical Storm Erika in 2015. And that is just recent history. And when we go throughout the history of the island and our islands across the space, we realize that all of this has been happening, and we have been able to survive within the Caribbean civilization. And to say we've been partnering with the local council, because we do have a tribal space, we do have a communal space that we live in, and all of these factors have seriously affected the development of our national strategies. So I'm excited because the conversation here it is a long one. It is someone I could spend days speaking to the importance of indigenous heritage, and the fact that as Caribbean, as small island states, we have discounted the importance of these people. And we are speaking about, we speak to and we allude to strategies that have been age-old heritage practices, but yet we call them different names. However, I will spend some time later today to speak to those and just to highlight them, because I think they're critical in ensuring that we continue to build our human capacity and our development of our commitments towards mitigating and adapting against climate change.
Thank you so much for that, Minister Cozier. What left with me was that the very existence of the indigenous people speak to our resilience and the importance of not discounting their knowledge and being part of this major climate change revolution that we want to see take effect. The data has shown that the voices of more women is very much needed in decision-making processes to help promote gender equality and women's empowerment. Turning to you, Ms. Hamilton, can you share a bit on St. Vincent and the Grenadines' gender mainstreaming efforts to ensure gender equality and inclusivity within its NDC implementation process?
Thank you, Misha. Good morning, everybody, again. So, as the Minister has just spoken about how the voices of indigenous peoples are often ignored in our processes and development of policies. I mean, it's a similar situation and I'm speaking here from the point of view of environmental sustainability. Never mind, Misha said I'm from the Ministry of Finance. That is a new occurrence. I transferred from the Sustainable Development Unit. So that is the lens I'm gonna view it with. So in all of the years of our work and we have tried to use a very consultative process when we're looking at development of policies and for project proposals as well. And of course, very often, the loudest voices are the ones you hear. Those are the ones that get counted in your policy development. And the loudest voices aren't necessarily always the most vulnerable. So those are usually the voices, the ones that are most heavily impacted. It's the voices of the vulnerable. And that's not only women. We're also talking about disabled. And in St. Vincent's case, unfortunately, the actual most vulnerable category of persons in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is older men, because they're the ones who have gone and spread their oats and have not paid attention to family life and are left to figure out what they're going to do when they've gotten to that point where they're no longer able to work out at 9 to 5. So what we've been working, and I think St. Vincent and the Grenadines came a little late to the game with regards to our national climate change policy, in that we only got that approved in 2019. During that process, we wanted to ensure that we heard all of the voices and that we not only heard the voices, but we also included in our policy as it regards climate change, that the voices of the vulnerable were important. So we do have a section in there that speaks to the necessity for gender consideration. And I know when we think gender usually, and not just us, but usually, and funding agencies as well, try to stick to mainly gender as in male, female, that binary space. And it's a little bit difficult for us in our context, in our national context, but as well, I think, to the broader Caribbean context, in that the way gender is discussed and the way gender manifests in the Caribbean is a little bit different than it manifests elsewhere, in that it's not that women don't have a voice, it's that it's who has that, who of women have that voice. Not saying that we don't have some of the same issues, I just think it manifests a little differently, so we have to approach it with we have to use a more nuanced approach to the way we're doing that, and that's what we wanted to do. So as I said, sorry, before I went off on that tangent, so we have that in our climate change policy, we have it in our climate change strategy, and so we wanted to continue that, and we also wanted to ensure that this NDC, when we revised it, that we also looked at not just whether or not we could achieve the targets set, ambitious as they are, but about the impacts that they would have on all sectors of the population, including the most vulnerable. So one of the activities that we did for our NDC revision was a gender mainstreaming roadmap, which was done in conjunction with Climate Promise and the Engender Project. We also have done a gender responsive private sector scoping study. So our intention is for, as we go along, for all of our policies and processes and projects to have to take into account gender considerations. It makes, and to be realistic as well, funding agencies are now requiring more explicit consideration of gender in your project proposals as well as in your reporting and in your M&E and in your indicators as well. So that as well has lent a push. We may not want to admit it, that it's because that some of the force is external, but let's be realistic that a good portion of the reason why we're focusing on gender is because of those external forces.
Thanks so much for that, Nyasha, and I'm glad that you would have lent perspective in terms of broadening the discussion in terms of gender, because what we are trying to do in terms of UNDP is also to be driven by the governments, but we also recognize that gender also includes other vulnerable and at-risk groups, specifically that of men, disabled women, and pregnant persons, as well as youth, in the critical as one of those vulnerable societies that we need to address. And within the Engender Project, those are some of the areas that we captured, having been driven by the country who said, these are our needs, these are our wants. So thanks, Nyasha, for bringing that insights and perspectives to the panel in the first introductory session. Over to you, Dr. Biner, to share a little bit with us on the perspectives from the 5 Cs. We heard a lot yesterday as it pertains to some of the cross-cutting themes. Specifically, we heard a lot about NDC implementation and the importance of taking a sectoral approach, having identified the energy and the transportation sector. Coming from the 5 Cs perspectives, can you share a little bit about your work in facilitating a cross-sectoral approach to enhancing NDC implementation, and if there are any challenges that you saw along the way that the countries may be having, and how the 5 Cs can support them in overcoming these?
Thanks, Nisha. Honorable Minister, fellow panel members, audience, thanks for inviting the center to share a few of the experiences it would have had in terms of looking at cross-sectoral issues related to NDC implementation. I do have a confession to make, however, at the very inception, which is the 5 Cs does not specifically focus on NDC implementation. What we focus on more is resilience building. And that is because we are coming from small island developing states, and there are certain peculiarities that we do have, which I'm quite sure you would have heard of many times before, inclusive of small size, which means that scale becomes an issue if we focus exclusively on the energy sector. The small size, however, can become an advantage because it lends itself more readily to the kind of cross-cutting issues that we are focusing on. So what the 5Cs has been promoting a lot is what we call the water, energy, food security nexus. What do we mean by that? 8 of the 40 most water scarce islands are found in the Caribbean. Barbados is one of 8 of the most water scarce islands in the world. Therefore, while we focus on water security as an important element or adaptation focus, we've often lent to that lens the issue of energy security as well. So in seeking to address water, we're combining that with providing water utilizing a renewable energy source. Because when water is in greatest demand, tends to be in the dry season. We have access to substantial solar energy. We have substantial opportunities for thermal energy. And so what the 5Cs has been doing is combining those two. We have run this model, for example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in Grenada, and currently in Barbados with the BWA. Now, what are some of the success factors? Clearly, you need to have government buy-in. And the projects must not be seen as an appendage to what is already happening, but integrated within the overall development paradigm. Additionally, it's important to bring multiple stakeholders on board, not during implementation, but from project conception. And so we have worked with BWA, we have worked with the utility companies, we have worked with government of Barbados. In the case of Grenada, we worked with Grenleg. And so we had that kind of collaborative approach moving forward. Challenges will always be there. And one of the things I asked about yesterday was costing our NDCs. If you don't know what it costs, how would you know how to measure it? In the negotiating fora, we've been arguing often about 100 billion per year. Where did that figure come from? And so if we are putting out, for example, we have a certain quantum of funds we're seeking to access, how much will be coming from private, how much will be coming from joint ventures, how much will be coming from multilaterals, how much will be coming from our national treasury. In that way, it gives us a holistic opportunity. And so one of the things we continue to grapple with is being able to unlock financing at scale. That's our major challenge. The countries are quite aware of what they need and how to get it. But we also have to turn that inwardly. So apart from the supply side constraint, the major demand side constraint, as we heard yesterday as well, is capacity. Because we have to demonstrate the absorptive capacity to be able to move these funds. Accessing climate financing is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And once those funds are unlocked, we have to have the systems and the capacity to be able to absorb and move them through. So we are very excited that we have seen the appetite, we have seen the desire, we have seen governments being more committed in moving these processes forward. And last but not least, there is a shift as well towards moving more towards what we call evidence-based interventions. So data is becoming more and more important. That it's not just about maladaptation, but it's also about building better for the future. Can't be doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bino. There were so much beautiful nuggets within that brief introduction. Building 5Cs being a resilience building center and how it's using the subsectors of energy, water, and food security to build the resilience of countries, working with countries to drive part of the development agenda, recognizing that it is important that the agenda not be driven necessarily from the architect of the funders or the 5Cs, but from national interest. So that bottom-up approach in terms of the 5Cs agenda, the importance of the budgeting process and the capacity supply constraints that we saw. We spent a lot of time discussing capacity constraints yesterday and possible solutions in terms of how we can seek to solve some of those. In the case on the budgetary process, I know for the Agenda project, we've been with the support of initiatives such as Climate Promise. We too have been supporting countries in the gender responsive budgeting, and some of them, namely St. Vincent, has taken that process and now be part of their national budgetary process. So it will be interesting to see as we continue to support the countries over the coming years, how they're able to advance and move forward those initial efforts that were made by entities and regional organizations such as the 5Cs. So I thank you for that interjection, Dr. Bino. Mr. James. Yesterday's session, we spent quite a bit of time as well also discussing the importance, the very, very importance of the meaningful participation of the youth within the climate change agenda. Can you share with us briefly your perspective in terms of the role of the youth, and have they been meaningfully engaged thus far from where you sit as the national coordinator of Antigua and Barbuda's youth environment network within the climate change process?
Sure, thank you for that question. So the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, CYEN, we've been an organization that's been around for almost 30 years, started in 1993, and we do a lot of work in terms of empowering young people within the Caribbean region, not just for the biological environment, but also their social environment as well. I would put the role of youth, and as the fellow, just kind of leading on from the fellow panelists, they raised a lot of the very same issues that's been repeating for decades, actually. Being heard from youth who have now graduated into older age, and we're still having the same conversations. Surprise, surprise. Yeah? But the very fact is that young people play an extremely important role in everything that has to do with our climate, particularly the fact that they're going to have to be the ones, we're going to have to be the ones that are going to be inheriting the decisions that are going to be made, that are being made today, whether it be in energy, in our culture, in our policies, and everything. From CYN's perspective, as an organization that is focused on empowering young people, we try to, and I like acronyms, so I kind of put it into like 3 E's to make it easier to kind of follow. So the first one would be about engagement. So of course, engagement is super important. As an organization, CYN, we participate and we partner with multiple organizations, local, regional, international. So each of our chapters, they would necessarily participate in programs that we do every year. So for example, our friends are in the room, like EAG, for example, we partner every year to participate in the International Coastal Cleanup, to get young people to actually engage and understand where the trash is in the environment. There have been times where we're literally cleaning up the beach and persons throw trash right out of the car, right? Why were they cleaning up? And so it helps to put it into context when young people get involved in projects and programs like that. Education is the other E. And it kind of following up from the last point about evidence-based. We recognize over the years, especially engaging through different projects and programs. And for example, last year, we partnered with FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, to host our inaugural Caribbean Youth for Climate Action Conference within the region, CYCA 2021. And that was a huge success. We actually did a survey covering young people across the Caribbean to actually collect data to find out where young people's minds are when it comes to the topic of climate and, you know, the need for action. And surprise, surprise, a lot of young people did stress that, hey, I've heard about this climate change stuff, but really and truly, you know, I don't really get that much information. And particularly, a lot of it doesn't necessarily come from a lot of the mainstream media that happens in our daily lives. They either get it necessarily through the church or through events or organizations like CYN. And given the gravity of what climate action and the kind of work that needs to happen, you would think that it would be more, prevalent, the forefront. But again, like I said, we're still having these conversations, aren't we? And the last E I would put would have to be towards empowerment. So the very fact that young people are going to have to live with the decisions that are being made today, it is extremely, extremely vital that they, and when person think about empowerment, they may think it means to be the person in charge. But empowerment also has the meaning of building confidence. And so it's super important for young people to be confident in ensuring that how the way we engage our leaders, or not only just our leaders, but even each other. Like I said, you can imagine cleaning up at the beach and watching somebody literally throw trash right back out there again. Why we having to come back and clean up the beaches every single year? So along those borders of three lines, a lot of the activities that CYN is involved with in terms of the role of young people is towards ensuring that we cover those three E's so that young people can, and it kind of falls into our logo where you actually see a C with a young person stepping forward into the future. It's all about getting young people to engage through education and empowering them so that they can become productive, active citizens and take the actions that we need to preserve our climate, our environment.
Thank you so much, Elijah, for those insights. It's good to see that the young people clearly aren't lagging behind, but in fact are leading the agenda, engagement, empowerment, education, and to see that being done in a very structured way within the Caribbean Youth Environment Network is very heartening to hear and very inspiring as well too. So it definitely provides a process for it. There's definitely not a need in terms of if there's meaningful engagement. There definitely is, and I think there's lessons to be learned from the Caribbean Youth Environment Network in terms of how the best fit approach can be taken to move that forward. So we're going to move into our second session, and thank you, panelists, for those introductory insights and perspectives. For this second session, we will have a general question, and I will repeat that question because it was a bit lengthy, and each panelist would have 5 minutes to answer that question. And the question is, opportunity or obstacle? How can Caribbean countries or your country embrace the integration of cross-cutting themes within the climate change agenda efforts, and what challenges have been encountered along the way, and what solutions are required to overcome these challenges? I'll repeat. Opportunity or obstacle? How have Caribbean countries or your country embraced the integration of cross-cutting themes within the climate change agenda, and what challenges have been encountered along the way, and what solutions are required to overcome these challenges?
Thank you so much. So on the island of Dominica, we have been able to respond to one of the most devastating climate events in the Caribbean. And it's very interesting because we had to respond on our own. And what I mean by that is the fact that after Hurricane Maria, losing more than 200, over 200% of our GDP, a number of commitments were given to our country from international organizations, from governments, etc. But we have not been able to collect on those sort of promises. And so our island had to use its own resources to bounce back. So while we're looking at all of the models and while we're integrating all of the different strategies within our governance structure to respond to climatic events, we are doing it with lack of finance, with very minimal transfer of technology, and also being on the very front line of major disasters like hurricanes. And so what we have done is to sort of step back and look towards what I spoke about earlier, the very important heritage aspects of the indigenous people that have survived over the years. And we understand that as a small island state, we do have a commitment with the Paris Agreement, and that's why we do have, as we speak, our revised NDCs. But we also know we are doing this on the serious duress, because we do not know if any level of certainty the resources that we will need. And because it appears to us that resilience is an expensive venture. And so like Doc said earlier on, we have to quantify it. We know what we want, we know where we expect to go, but however, we know we have limitations. And so the call has been one that we had this call last year in COP26 in Scotland to have the major emitters contribute. And we have not seen anything forthcoming. We are stepping into COP27 in Egypt, in Cairo, Egypt this year. And we on the island, we get the sense that the major emitters speak to us in sort of a very condescending manner and saying what we ought to do. And when we reflect on the suggestions and those ideas and those commitments that they want us to sign on to and to actually input into our governance system, we realize that it's only to their benefits, whereas they are not able to come forward to provide the necessary resources to empower our governance structures. And so it is something that we've been doing, and so we have to look inward. We realize in terms of the Caribbean civilization, whenever there's crisis, people look inward. Our most recent crisis, the COVID-19, we look inward and decide how we're going to manage our countries. We had no solution from the international world because it was sort of a new frontier. And even within the constructs of climate change, it has always been sort of a new frontier for small island states like Dominica. And so we have been engaging various agencies across the board. My ministry is tasked with coordinating because we do not have a Department of Environment. So we've been coordinating all of the multinational agreements. And so climate change mitigation and resilience goes across a number of different sectors. And so we have to pull all of this together. And in so doing, we develop after Maria the CREED, which is the resilience agency, a climate resilience executing agency for the island. And what CREED did is to pull together all of the various tasks that were across various ministries and to help to coordinate it. Because like I mentioned, we do have limitations in human capacity. And so the CREED became the sort of overarching entity that guided the processes. So in the 4 years after Hurricane Maria, we've been able to pull all our resources together and to look at the human capacity and how we push projects forward. What we have been able to do also is able to look, like I said, toward the indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices. And for instance, we have a project that we're doing right now in terms of managing solid waste, which is a problem across the Caribbean. And it's something that if we do it well, we want to share that model with different islands. And what we're doing within the Carnival space, we have unearthed an age-old tradition of separation of garbage. And so the project basically empowers the community to pass on the knowledge of the ancestors as to how do we separate biodegradable waste and plastics and bottles, because we realize that within the past generations we have had an increased use for waste management because of a sort of complete shift of lifestyles. And so for a long time within the island we have discounted the indigenous heritage. We sought to bring in plastics, bottles. We sought to create spaces where we have collective depositing of garbage, and all of this was not part of the heritage before. And so it was sort of a new concept. So now what we do, we're doing a full circle, going back to the age-old knowledge of separating garbage at the home. And so it appears to be a very, very simple exercise. But it's something that if we magnify it across the region and we do it well, we'll be able to manage all of what we have. And in terms of protecting our beachfront, and we speak about the Caribbean being the tourist destinations and how do we treat that. And even on the island itself, we speak about the nature island itself. And so this small intervention, which leans heavily on indigenous knowledge, is one that will I believe will augur well for the Caribbean civilization. And so we've been leading heavily also on the governance of our community. Because I don't know if you already know, fellow panelists and the folks here online, that we have a unique governance structure in the indigenous community in Dominica. We have land in common. So we are operating within the constructs of a communalist society. And so we are all tenures of all of the lands. And we are adhering to the age-old philosophy of protecting Mother Earth. And in so doing, we have a tribal council. And the tribal council is one that provides governance and for that particular space, and a council that has gone across gender lines. So even as I speak today, our council of 6 elected councillors are 3 men, 3 women. The tribal chief is a sovereign leader, and he's also the chair of the council. And in doing development interventions within that space, government by law is forced to interact with that community. And so, serving as the Minister for the Environment and Kalinago Upliftment, I serve as that sort of conduit between the local community and the central government. So it's an exciting model that exists, and I think it's something that we could share with the rest of the region. How do we, as government institutions and government authority, work with local communities? And how do we partner in doing all that we need to ensure that we can create a better space?
Thank you so much for that, Minister Cozier. It's always good to see a passionate minister, so definitely involved with his community. But what I like in terms of the offering of the solution was looking inward. So much times we tend to think the solutions will come outwardly from international consultancies, but there are a number of best practices that have been working for the region well over a number of years, and a number of critical knowledge is how we enhance that knowledge, how we ensure that the knowledge is transferred, how we ensure that persons are empowered and in the specific places to be able to take up spaces, to be able to change that knowledge is going to be critical. Turning to you now, Dr. Bino, opportunity or obstacle, how have Caribbean countries embraced the integration of cross-cutting themes within their climate change implementation efforts? What challenges have they encountered along the way, and what are some of the solutions that can help overcome these challenges?
Okay, once again, first of all, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center works through what we call a regional framework. That regional framework articulates currently 11 strategic thematic goals. It was compiled based on extensive consultations with the various countries who would have identified the specific goals they wish to see. That framework is being taken forward to the heads of government to be signed off on. That becomes our framework in which to engage with the countries. In terms of the cross-cutting issues, as I said before, we focus on resilience rather than adaptation or mitigation, because what we find is that through combining the two, you're able to get a much more robust, impactful, and efficient project rather than either or. Our economies are just too small to be focusing on one or the other. The countries themselves have largely bought into this because, as I said, the size does lend as an advantage because we are small enough to be able to use that cross-sectoral approach rather than the siloed approach that we often hear of. We are not without our respective challenges, but before I go to that, I use the example of the project in Barbados, popularly known as WSRN, where we're working with the BWA. Not only are we enhancing water security, but we also inserting tanks across the islands so that there's no discriminatory practices, and that's one of the things we need to emphasize, where there is integrated infrastructure and you're taking on board, as Nyasha mentioned, those vulnerable groups, the elderly, the differently abled, youths, then you begin to put those systems in place, because what the center has as well is a gender policy. We have an environmental safeguards and management strategy. We also have grievance mechanisms, as well as your AML. So all of these, when we develop a project, would have to go through those screening processes to ensure those elements are incorporated. But we have only been able to work in that way and to achieve what we have achieved. And my good colleague, C.Y. Yen, indicated he likes acronyms. I like them too. And I say we work with 3 Ps. Whatever we do is first and foremost about people, it's about partnerships, and it's about policies, right? People is always at the center of whatever we're doing. The partnerships, my good colleague from CCRE, I don't see Sedema here, CIMH, these are all our partners through whom we work. We can only get so much done when we are able to work through partnerships and policies, because quite often you may have to make some policy adjustments to get the kind of impact you're looking for. So you hear a lot about we need to pivot to renewable energy. We need to have more renewable energy in the system. But there is the policy dimension in terms of, do we have the framework to allow for net billing or feed-in tariffs? Who will deal with the baseload issue and the redundancy capacities that are necessary to be there? So these are all elements that we have to look at. In terms of our challenges, there are always challenges. And I don't want to speak to the Caribbean as though it's a homogeneous mass. It's not. And there are idiosyncrasies as you go from country to country, and therefore we have to always be contextual. But one approach that we have used is to use what we call a multi-country approach. There will be some countries that have more capacity than others, and where those countries have the capacity, we work with them individually. But where certain capacities may be absent, we use what we call an inside-outside approach. Those who follow basketball will know, you can have the big guys who are driving to the rim, or you can have the outside approach where you have Steph Curry and Klay Thompson hitting down trees. In that way, you are conditioning the approach based on the realities you face on the ground. Outside of that, it is also important to engage with your local entities and your local institutions very early. One of the things we often neglect to look at is that there's a high level of informality in the Caribbean, okay? And when we speak often, we speak almost as if all systems are in place. No. How do we deal with the informal sector? In some economies, the informal sector is as large as the formal sector. How do we bring them in? So that ultimately, when we speak of resilience building, we're not speaking about a small sliver of the economy. And that continues to be a challenge that we have to examine. How do we seek to overcome those? We seek to overcome those, as I said, we take a multi-country approach. We take a discussion approach. As my colleague said, you have the engagement early, not after the project is approved. We try to bring our partners in. But let's face it, we represent 14 sovereign states and 16 if we count CARIFORUM. A donor coming in providing us $20 million for Caribbean states. We can do the math, okay? 20 divided by 14 is just about 1.5. That's stretched over 4 or 5 years. That works out to no more than about $300,000 per year, okay? So when we speak about having projects at scale, we're not being facetious. These are real realities that we face. Building capacity will continue to be an ongoing process because we also see significant leakages from our region. Our brightest, our smartest, our more nimble always tend to find other opportunities. Sometimes they're lost from the region, and so capacity building and training has to be a continuous process. But capacity must not only be seen as human capacity. I continue to make a plug for enhanced data management. data must be seen as a resource and not as an add-on. Otherwise, we continue to do the same thing. Where climate change is concerned, we speak to resilience, recognizing that resilience is not a one-stop. You know, the minister mentioned we hear different concepts today: nature-based adaptation or ecosystem-based adaptation. Those concepts have been with us a long time. It's just that we change the name, we shake up the bottle, and we have a new flavor. But the reality is, how do we get some of those practices into the official system? And so where data is concerned, even if we don't have the official data set, use the indigenous knowledge, because the history of people living in particular location can help us to better see how to proceed. And the last point I'd like to make, which continues to be a challenge, is that many times you hear Caribbean states speak as if they always come in cap in hand. It's not that we come in cap in hand, but we do face some critical factors. And that is why our major focus has often been on adaptation financing. It is easy to speak about mitigation, but the major problem we face with the mitigation window is that we do not have the scale. We have gone to market quite often, and the projects that we have are too small to have the big guys really being involved. When you come to adaptation, it is difficult making a business case to crowd in the private sector. So people speak about, why do you need concessional financing? We need it because the private sector would not often finance mangrove reforestation. They will not often finance coral reef restoration, except they can see a direct benefit. And quite often, they are very slow to come to the table until it is a proven concept that will work. And so I am not knocking the private sector out. All I'm saying is that these are the realities that we face on the ground, and we have to be cognizant of that. So when we speak about concessional financing, is because most of our needs are in the areas of adaptation, where those funding tend not to be readily available. And because some of our countries have graduated into middle income status, unlocking concessional financing becomes even more difficult. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Baino. I know facilitators, we're running a little short on time, but I think the perspectives and insights being shared here are too important to ignore or even try to segue and cut out all. Presenting the business case on the importance of adaptation versus mitigation, the three P's, very critical insights. And thank you, Dr. Baino, for sharing those with us today. Going to you, Mr. James. Opportunity or obstacle, and then I would end with Nyasha. And if we have the indulgence of the facilitators, I'll skip straight to allow the participants if they have any questions. So over to you, Mr. James.
Sure. So to your question, which was very long, so I was trying to just kind of keep it in parts so I could kind of follow.
No problem. So opportunity or obstacle, how can Caribbean, and in your case, Antigua, embrace the integration of cross-cutting issues? And that would be issues relating to gender, youth, women empowerment, indigenous knowledge, and what obstacles or challenges have come and what potential solutions are there?
So that's a great question. And I think our Trinidad and Tobago chapter led a climate justice conference, actually, three-day conference, which helped me to prepare me for this very question. So I'll share some highlights from that. From CYN's perspective, and I'm just going to try to embrace the issue of time, we recognize that when it comes to engaging young people, it is not just simply a one-size-fits-all kind of model. And a lot of agencies still, even government, don't quite get that concept to this very day. I don't understand why. Because again, as we heard from the other panelists, keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result, don't make no sense. So from day one of that conference itself, we recognize that, the one-size-fits-all doesn't work. And even from CYN's perspective, we've actually changed our approach in terms of how we engage young people. And what we've started doing is actually creating spaces for them. So we know, for example, somebody might not be passionate about land management. They don't care. That's a simple fact. We saw that come out from the feedback of the survey when we realized the data. But we want to, of course, ensure that we engage them so that they can get the education, so they can become empowered to be able to take climate action seriously. And so what we've done, we've participated in different projects. So, for example, we had the Recipes for Resilience project that we did with our friends from UE and University of Edinburgh and quite a few other partners. And what that did was to basically engage young people on the issue of food and music and culture in terms of the relationship between that and our environment. And that was a huge success as well in terms of engaging young people who wanted to be engaged in that manner, so to speak. All right. Another point that came out of that climate justice conference was the emphasis on looking at partnerships and natural solutions within our environment. Because a lot of times, as you said, we tend to try to look outside and expect to depend on the agencies, because that was actually one of the questions in our survey, where we asked persons, young people, who do you think was responsible or should be responsible for climate action within our community? And surprisingly, a lot of persons thought it was probably international agencies or government. And so they didn't see themselves as being responsible. And again, this is why the education and the engagement is so important. What we recognize about education is once people become aware, their attitudes and the behaviors generally, because it doesn't happen all the time, but generally, once you engage and you educate people, their attitudes about the issues change. So before they used to throw the bottle outside, they start thinking a little bit and consider putting it into possibly recycling bin or, not damaging the environment. So that was another highlight for us. And of course, the issue of resiliency and adaptation within communities was another big topic coming out of that activity, where we basically spoke about the need for highlighting to communities and basically letting them understand they have a responsibility to take care of themselves. At the end of the day, still, the young people are going to have to inherit the decisions that are being made today. And so the whole need to empower them and letting them understand that only by your actions can you kind of secure your own future, because standing on the sidelines is just not going to work. And one of the last points that came out of that conference, day 3, was about the need for indigenous climate action. So there was the highlight of the fact that many indigenous communities safeguard most of the world's biodiversity all around the world. Yet still, they are basically facing the biggest challenges to it. And coming back to your point about, for example, obstacles. As an organization, nonprofit, of course, CYEN depends on securing partnerships and resources. And so even though we have these amazing young people around the region who are passionate about the environment, and we try to engage other young people and even the other public to get it done, not necessarily having the resources to do so limits our reach. And even within that, one of the other issues that we also face as an obstacle, but we like obstacles because we like finding solutions, is even with the general media, as I mentioned before. The issue of climate action and climate, even though, every day outside get hotter and hotter, and we literally have a heat wave warning happening right now in Antigua for tomorrow. And you will not find the mainstream media giving the kind of attention that needs to happen for the public to be able to engage. And so these are just some of the issues that, from a youth perspective, that we recognize. And again, like I said, we try to highlight engaging young people in different spaces. And we've actually moved to the point where we're utilizing technology now as a way of getting more young people involved and giving them access to the information that they need. So, for example, when we talk about NDCs, many young persons are not even aware of how they can be engaged. And so projects like, for example, our Stay Alive and Thrive campaign, which kind of builds on the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign that we did, we championed a few years ago, highlights, and we're actually building out a site and app to guide young people as to, if you want to engage or you want to participate, how you can do in your own particular country. So those are just some of the things that we're working on from the CYM perspective. But again, just to kind of bring it all together, the reality is that young people, the one-size-fits-all model doesn't work. So we need to stop. Find young people where we are, meet, engage us, let us be a part of the solutions, because we have to inherit the future.
Thank you so much for that, Elijah. Just yesterday, I believe a colleague on the floor raised the issue of behavioral change. So it was good to see necessarily that the youth have embraced behavioral change through the education, through the empowerment components within the program. Because sometimes when you think of these things, we think that there are hard measures to adopt. But if we look inward to some of the traditional processes, we'll see that a number of times the solutions are there. Over to you, Nyasha. Last but by no means least, opportunities or obstacles.
Thanks, Misha. And given the great responses that the other panelists have given, now I'll say something brief. I think they've given great responses, and to build upon that, I don't think it's an either or thing. I think it's a both. It's both an opportunity and an obstacle. Coming from an implementation perspective, is that cross-cutting issues, looking at things with those cross-cutting issues gives you an opportunity to be more efficient and effective in your implementation, because it means that you could tackle multiple issues with one effort. And I'm not saying that you should do it for everything, but when it makes sense to do it that way, I think you should, because a lot of the times the stakeholders that you want to target with regard to your cost-cutting issues there's usually a huge amount of overlap. And especially because I initially said when we're doing project implementation, when we're doing project proposals, when we're doing policy development, we like to take a participatory approach. If you're going to go to your stakeholders for multiple things over and over and basically asking them the same questions but about different things, you end up with stakeholder fatigue. And I know you said that approach the youth where they are, but even the youth get fed up of us when we come to them multiple times over and over asking them questions basically about the same thing but for different sectors kind of thing. So that's what I'm saying. So, but it's also an obstacle in that, because I think a couple of things are missing in this cross-cutting issue, in that it doesn't speak about capacity and it doesn't speak about finance. And capacity and finance are going to create obstacles in us dealing with these cross-cutting issues. Because for some islands, the agencies that are dealing with these issues, even if you're looking at it coming together all together, the agencies that are dealing with these issues are usually very, very small. Gender may be a 2-person unit. Environment may be, I know it's not Antigua's case, but environment may be a 5-person unit, and something else may be a 1-man party. So that creates an obstacle, because then people have to prioritize, and your priority may not be somebody else's priority as well. And then, so that's both the challenge as well, and that brings me to the solution, in that sometimes, even though we like to talk about a bottom-up approach, sometimes you have to have a top-down approach as well. Sometimes the mandate for refocusing and reprioritization has to come from the policymakers. It has to come from above, because otherwise, if it doesn't come from above, everybody will stick to what they think the priorities are for their specific agency or sector. And that then itself, although I know Dr. Bino says that we're trying to move away from thinking and working in silos, I unfortunately have to disappoint you a little in that there are still a lot of silo thinking and silo working going on, and that is why I think we need a top-down approach to get us to dealing with these cross-cutting issues in a more effective and efficient manner. And I'll leave it there. Thanks. Because I'm sure the audience has some exciting questions.
Thank you so much, Nyasha, for that. I must say, in terms of wrapping up, it was a real delight to be able to moderate today's session. I come from an NGO background, having headed the Barbados Renewable Energy Association, and also a government background, working with the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries, Inc., and sometimes being the one person tasked with championing services. So I know fully well the constraints and the concerns that were mentioned, and face them and sat within those seats. So it's heartening to see those being tabled and brought to the forefront. So in terms of a quick wrap up, cross-cutting and emerging and cross-cutting themes, definitely we see the importance of gender, but not only gender within the traditional context, but gender which has been expanded to be understood. Also the integration of men, other vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities, the youth, women, as well as pregnant women, as well being part of that. We have also seen the inclusion as well as our indigenous people being able to integrate within the climate change agenda. And we've seen the importance of taking a cross-sectoral approach in terms of building resilience and building capacity to be able to achieve a number of those climate change goals. But more importantly, I think what we left here today was a number of acronyms, but I think a number of useful ones were mentioned, and key to that being people, engagement, education, and empowerment. So I now hand over to the facilitators and to you, the persons on the floor, to if there's any questions that you may want to pose towards the panelists. And can I ask that when you pose the question that you state your name and just the organization that you're attached to. Thank you. Yeah, your voice is, yeah, just project.
And what you guys are trying to achieve? There it was.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. There's a Solid Waste Corporation, which is a statutory body, which sits, which I happen to supervise as the minister. But what we have in terms of solid waste management, we have a landfill, quote unquote landfill, which was formerly a quarry. And so we converted the quarry into a landfill for waste management. And so that in itself has limitations. So we've had a 25-year run, and it appears to us that we will come to a full capacity in the next 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years. And so we sort of have to retrack and look at how do we, in the first instance, not produce or allow disposal of garbage in that particular site. And when we look to the traditional indigenous knowledge, we realize that folks were managing waste at their homes. So all of the biodegradable material would have gone into the gardens, into the farms. The plastics and the bottles were recycled, water collection, for vegetable production, etc. And there were very minimal like fabric, etc. that came out. And in that instance, in the previous time, most of those material were burnt, which in our context is not a good model. So it means that we have to tip those into the garbage disposal sites. And so what we're doing is to create that model where we in a scientific way manage solid waste disposal from the home. And so what we have done, we're working with the OECS, the REMIT project, and the government of Canada to provide members of the community with receptacles, and also working across the community to develop biodegradable sites where we can convert that material into compost, into manures, etc. And so that's the idea basically. And so what have we been doing? We started in the Kainagua space as the First Nations, as the people who had that sort of that ancient knowledge. And what we're going to do in the next 3 years is to replicate that model across different communities across the island. And so the intent at the end would be to limit all that garbage at the disposal site, which was not, like I told you, designed for that in the first instance. And so what we're also doing, we're hoping that that if we do it well, and being in tune with the proclamation by our Prime Minister to be the first climate resilient country, that we can use that model and share with various other jurisdictions and across the Caribbean region itself.
Thank you, Minister. And by the way, I apologize, Stanley Barreto, Mega Power. And just a secondary question to that point, this is organic waste then, in particular, or this is, because from what I'm understanding is you're going to assist all Dominican citizens in trying to better utilize or better repurpose this organic waste. But this doesn't deal with inorganic waste, should I say, like polycarbonates or any of that stuff, right?
Right. So these other ways they go into the landfill, and what we've been doing now is another project to compress material to package the plastics and to have them shipped out. We have been working with a few private agencies from the French departments, and who will take on that material, and so we're shipping it out of the island rather than storing it in our limited space that we have.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, all, Honorable Minister, panel, Chair. I just wanted to share a little bit and to also perhaps ask a question or two regarding our outreach. I'm very interested in what CYEN is doing regionally. I think it's excellent work. In fact, I will invite everyone to applaud CYEN as always taking the youth message throughout the region on climate change and other environmental matters. The reality is, though, that I'm wondering why it is that we don't have an annual KAP. You spoke about the survey work that CYEN is already doing and the findings that you're having. And I really do believe that, it is something that we can use that would also take into account the cross-cutting issues that we're discussing. In addition to that, I would say that we tend to do KAPs on various things as a one-off. For example, Barbados would have done one specifically on climate change and understanding and trying to find out what the public felt, but that was since 2005. We need to update that. And I'm really believing that it is this sort of evidence-based information that would help us plan better in terms of climate resilience and show climate resilience action. In addition to that, public perception is extremely important, and yes, I'm checking my notes, interlaced with the science. So that would make for, much better public policy arrangements and making public policy worthwhile with everyone's input, because we really and truly need to have that kind of integrated approach to what we're doing. So I'm just thinking that perhaps 5Cs and CYEN could get together and work on this kind of thing at the regional level, work on having KAPs on an annual basis so that we actually know where we are regionally. And of course, it should help inform our NDC implementation throughout the region, and especially through Climate Promise. So these are just some suggestions that I'm having. In addition to that, I just wanted to let you know, in terms of youth and action for climate, there's the Ashley Lashley Foundation in Barbados, and they're going to be hosting a youth summit that looks specifically at climate action. And I believe that's going to be taking place in July, early July. And that foundation has announced already, yes, their youth climate action, is it a symposium? No, it's actually a summit. So I think that these are things that are showcasing what young people are already capable of doing. They need our support, but then I think we need to have them play an active role in the continuous monitoring of what we're doing. And this should then feed in with Climate Promise and other efforts into our NDC efforts as a region. I also liked Mark's point, if I may call you Mark, Dr. Bino, on looking at vulnerable groups. I have a very soft spot for persons with disabilities, and more we keep saying that all of these people need to be at the table. We need to really and truly take action in this regard. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that question and the feedback as well, suggestions. I'll tell you this, you couldn't have been more clearer on the very fact that one of the biggest problems that we have within the Caribbean, and probably the wider world, is that is the issue of planning. The Caribbean Youth for Climate Action conference that we held last year is intended to be an annual event. And so we have 2022 coming up, where basically what we wanted to do was, just like we converged for COP and COI, we wanted to have something specifically for the Caribbean, where we highlighted our individual, or I could say indigenous challenges, more so to the region, as opposed to just speaking on the global context of things as well, from the young people's perspective. One of the issues, and to your specific question about outreach, and as I mentioned before, one of the things we recognize over the years, the work that we've been doing, is that, again, we all live in little bubbles, communication bubbles, so to speak, meaning that even just like we're here right now, anything that's happening outside of this room, we're not going to be engaging in unless we have a central hub or point that we can go to find this kind of information. And that is kind of what has drove the idea for CYN to build the technological platform that will basically highlight opportunities, just like Ashley Lashley conference is coming up and any other activities that are happening within the region. Because if you ask yourself the question right now, where do you go to find out information or anything that's happening unless you're in that specific channel or space of information? It doesn't exist. And kind of coming back to the point that was raised earlier, and again, for me, it bothers me that, decade after decade, we keep talking about the same things, whether it be from the level of COP, locally in our own indigenous communities, and there just seems to be this almost, I don't know if I want to call it like resistance, but it is just, for some reason, we just don't seem to want to come together to have a plan. And the reason why planning is so important is because it puts everybody on the same perspective. Because even though all the different agencies are doing their own different work in the different spaces, if we don't know what the end goal that we're all trying to get to, then it's just like having two people rowing at different ends of the boat. Somebody's trying to go this direction, somebody's trying to go that direction, as opposed to pooling our resources together or shifting our energies so that every single year, because the goal that we're hoping that to come out of the CYCA is that we don't have to be talking about the same things that we spoke about last year, because we would have accomplished them and been able to move forward and taken the plan that much closer to resilience.
I'll just say thanks for your response.
Thank you so much. Rashawn Adams-Matthew, ESS and Gender Officer at the Department of Environment. Unfortunately, I had an earlier meeting, so I couldn't be here earlier to hear the discussions. I was particularly excited when I saw on the agenda the cross-cutting themes. So if it is I'm asking a question that you may have addressed, my apologies. A common trend that I have noted when it comes to considerations for gender within SIDS and that eventually reaches the international negotiating circles, it's mainly threefold. It's one, there are a lot of, I think, stereotypes on what gender conditions are. In the Caribbean, I think they take a very broad brush. They see the word developing country and they compare it. There is an overemphasis on looking at one aspect of gender, so we constantly state that gender is not a woman's issue or women are not a homogeneous group. But then when we have gender discussions, that's all we talk about. We don't talk about like other factors and different areas of vulnerability, understanding that all women have the same level of vulnerability. And at least from the department's perspective, we have found that a lot of that comes out of the fact that a lot of our local agencies are not themselves providing the data or conducting the analysis for funding. So we have at least tried within the last 5 years to build our own capacity, both to collect data, to analyze that data and to submit it for funding. But we do note that it's a common trend within SIDS. So coming from, I think, the perspectives of St. Vincent and Dominica and CYN as country agencies, maybe you can share with us on how you are working or if you have built capacity when it comes to gender mainstreaming. Buzzword, but I just mean in terms of data collection, the way that you budget, the way that you apply for funding, and then for CCCD, whether or not CCCD is providing any support for countries to increase that capacity.
Oh, thanks. So I did say it, but you probably want to hear it. But yes. So briefly, we've been trying to, and I did say that we are trying to broaden the scope of gender from just looking at it as a binary function as men versus women, and to include other vulnerable populations. So with that view, we have also included those sorts of considerations into our policy documents as well as in implementation plans. We are the budget director, which comes in the Ministry of Finance, has been very open to the idea of including gender budgeting. But of course, with everything else, and it's a capacity issue, it's going to have to be rolled out in phases, because there has to be, somebody's going to have to go into the ministries and basically hold their hands to guide them through that process. And given the capacity constraints of our ministries, that is going to be have to be a phased approach. So of course, more than likely you start with with the larger ministries, which would be Ministry of Finance and probably Health. But I'm speaking here from a personal capacity. I don't know which ministries they would focus on, but that is something that he's open to doing. We as well, I think I kind of forgotten the last of your question, but that's okay. So we've, for our NDC revision, we have done complementary activities, one of which is a gender mainstreaming roadmap, which focuses in this roadmap on 4 sectors. That's energy, tourism, finance, and shucks, I forget the 4th one. But four to start with. And as well as that gender mainstreaming roadmap, which we hope to, of course, implement and then use those as demonstration for the other sectors to implement the same sort of mainstreaming gender into their daily activities. So that starts from your budgeting process. So when you're proposing capital projects, whether that's for external or local funding, that you have included what would be the budgetary implications for ensuring that all sectors of the population, that's including the people who you're accustomed to serving, but also the vulnerable populations who tend to get overlooked. What would be the budget implications for ensuring that your project impacts all of those populations, as well as the capacity issues that would come with that? Because of course you're looking, if you want to implement well, then you have to look beyond. And we're already having capacity issues doing the things that you're accustomed to doing. So of course, you have to look at what would be the capacity requirements for that much broader consideration. Oh, and we've also done a gender responsive private sector scoping. So looking at your legislation and on all of that as to how private sector can now participate in NDC implementation.
If I may, just before we move on, because I would like to hear from Dominica. So in terms of the actors that actually perform the activity, so the data that goes into the gender budgeting that you're talking about, as well as the development of your gender responsive scope, is that done by local actors or local agencies, or is that you bring in a consultant?
We worked with a consultant, but the way that we have been working, and we would have to thank Canary for this model, because they worked with us on our national climate change policy, is that consultant has to work with locals, and it's not just, we're not just coming with just one big consultation. But I mean, you start, because we never used to do it before, so you start with a stakeholder engagement plan. So you have to set out how you're going to engage your different groups of stakeholders. You're not just having one broad consultation where only loudest voices get heard. You're doing focus groups. So basically, your stakeholders are having a voice in doing these things. So in your project development, not so much in the gender budgeting sector, because of course that is a government process. So there isn't really much scope as it stands right now for non-government input into that budgeting process. But as I said, because you're going to be proposing capital projects, your capital projects, when they're going in, you have to have had consultations with the stakeholders who will be impacted by that project. So indirectly, they will have input into that budgeting process.
Okay, just before I hand over to Minister, I just wanted to share with you, one of the things that we recognized also that came out of the research that we were doing was that we saw, based on the gender lines, different trends based on priorities. So we recognize, for example, the fact that something as simple as being able to have access to work or higher education changed, or the views from persons based on that line and gender was very different. And so that's something that we also have to keep in mind when we're looking at the whole plans for what we're doing. So.
In terms of the Dominica context, we have when we develop our national resilience strategy, we ensured that there was a piece within the documentation and the strategy to incorporate gender, and very important. And so for us, gender mainstreaming is not just cliche; it is actually in our entire resilience strategy, and it is similar for the structure of the CREED, which is the Climate Resilience Executing Agency. And some of the key pillars in the CREED as policy decisions is to ensure that serious consideration be given to the gender issues that will arise from time to time. Even within the constructs of the indigenous people itself, we have also considered some of the limitations that would have been afforded indigenous women, and some of the issues that would clearly define them from other women within the island itself. And so across the board in our conversations, in our strategies, we have been able to input the importance of gender mainstreaming. Even in our updated NDCs, we have clearly articulated the way we want to deal with the issues of gender. But what's also very, very important, and while doing the research for all of this, we realized that within the constructs of the Caribbean itself, the region, it is something a troublesome subject matter, because we have parameters, we have created parameters for our laws, and through our civil society agencies like the church, that clearly defines aspects of gender, and so we are struggling with this on our island because. The only way I believe, and I've argued this many times, we can really deal with the gender issues is if we get rid of somewhat those ancient and very, very draconian barriers that we have, and it's actually existing in our laws. So it's going to be difficult, but to say that we have as a government made these policy decisions, and to ensure that we address those, and even in certain instances we have highlighted gender as a very definitive vulnerable grouping, and likewise indigenous people, because realize that they have particular situations, and when we lay them out as that vulnerable group, we have an opportunity to dig deeper and to understand all of the issues that may arise, and even at the budget level, we have been able to input the importance of gender sensitive budgeting practices, and excited because we do have a Ministry of Planning, which is tied in with climate resilience, and so we have had some leadership here from a very powerful, strong colleague here, Dr. Vince Henderson, in terms of really helping to define the gender piece, which I think is something that we may have to add to the regional conversation, because I believe there are too many draconian parameters that defines what gender is, and some of those we don't feel comfortable speaking about them in certain circles, because we run the risk of stepping on toes in the room. But to say on the island we have been able to give some serious considerations for those.
Thank you so much, Minister, and thank you so much, panelists, for those insights and perspectives as the gender.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, sorry. No, the last part of my question, I wanted to hear from the CCCD if it is there provided any support when it came to capacity building for local.
CCCD?
Yeah, it's
five
5Cs. I'm saying CCCD. I'm sorry. 5Cs.
Facilitators, do we have time for that final question?
Just very quickly. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
So, Thank you, panelists, again for the insights shared today. It was quite heartening as a gender specialist to hear the panel speak so eloquently of the gender issues, both from the indigenous perspective, both from the perspective of the youth, both from the perspective in terms of women, and we're also able to highlight some of the other vulnerable groups which we focus on in terms of the persons with disabilities. Leading, because coming from the gender perspective, sometimes we get a heart snake in terms of speaking in terms of our own language. So to see that the panelists were so able to confidently speak to those issues, it was quite heartening to hear. So thank you again, and I hand over now to the facilitators for the session, and apologies for going over time.
What a great session. What a great session. Thank you, Misha. Thank you to our esteemed panelists, Minister, Mr. Dr. Bino from the 5Cs, Elijah and Nyasha. Thank you. Colleagues, will shift gear a little bit now, and I'd like to welcome our UNDP Comms specialist, Ms. Daniela Perez, to provide a brief presentation on some of the interesting stories we've seen coming out of the Climate Promise implementation here in the region. Noting that we're running out of time, what we'd like to suggest is that we have a working coffee break. So if you just make your way to the back, grab something quickly and get back to your respective spaces, and we can continue with session 2. Thank you. Colleagues, we would be starting in approximately 1 minute. So kindly get your snacks, your break, and make your way back to your seats. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone got their coffees. Can you hear me?
You just
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'll give you a few more seconds to get your coffees. So, thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for giving me the space to speak to you today. My name is Daniela Peris. I'm the Climate Promise Communications Specialist for the Latin American and the Caribbean region. And I want to talk to you today about communicating, but particularly communicating, using a storytelling approach to communicate about the impact of the climate promise, but of anything really. So in the next 15 minutes, I will try to cover why we should tell stories, a little bit of the aspects of communicating about climate change, and sorry, because I cannot really control my slides. I'm kind of like trying to remember. So, and also show you a little bit of examples of what this storytelling looks like, and some stories and ideas for inspiration. So why tell stories? Well, first of all, to put a face on development. We want to move away from the traditional way of communicating and sort of speaking about our work and what we do. And as much as important as it is, that's not the story. What we want to tell, the story we want to tell is the impact that our work is having on people's lives. And that's what storytelling is about. Second, we want to give voice to the populations that we work with. We want people to tell their stories themselves and not us telling their stories for them. So we also need to go beyond numbers and help people understand why our work matters. As much as we like to deny it or not admit it, our brains are pretty much driven by emotions, and we need stories to be able to understand the world around us. So while the generation of knowledge is crucial, we see that the reports that we write, not everyone gets access to that information, and not everyone can process that information. So I wanted to show here an example of the study done by the World Bank, where they saw that over 30% of the reports between 2008 and 2012 had never been downloaded, not even once. I was also thinking of the latest IPCC report, and it's nearly 3,000 pages, and I don't know the numbers for how many people downloaded that, but good, great to see that. That's, yeah, I would be worried that was, but So, that's why we have these summaries for policymakers. That's why we have the headlines of the summary for policymakers. That's why we have the news articles and the blogs to sort of break it down. We also like to do these explainer videos for people to disseminate on social media, in which not only we tell the facts that this report is telling us, but also we combine that with the emotional side of what does this mean for people, in practice. And this is an example of a video done by our director, Cassie Flynn. And so, again, it's important to connect the facts, connect the figures with the emotions, because it is emotions what moves and motivates people to take action. And that's what we want. And then also we see that when people are made feel something positive by organizations or by a certain brand, it has been reported that those people then feel more connected to the brand, to the organization, and that's what we want to create, that's what we want to generate. So, to sum up, don't communicate, tell stories instead. Don't be project-oriented, be human-centered. Don't do a monologue. Care about the audience. Don't just give the numbers. Make sure that you combine those with the stories, with the emotions. And also be visual and colorful and innovative. That's all what storytelling is about. So about climate storytelling, communicating about climate change is an extremely complex issue, because climate change is extremely complex, as you have been speaking about until now, and how to engage people. So the first point that I wanted to make and I wanted to bring is hopelessness leads to inaction. There is a risk of being too alarmist, although it is important, of course, to understand what the seriousness of the issue is. We cannot just leave it at that, because that makes people want to disengage. So we need to give a hopeful perspective to the work that we're doing. We need to convey how a future that is green and that is sustainable can look like. We need to give stories of hope so that people can actually think that change is possible. So that, related to that, the narratives that you use matter, and we need to be careful about how we communicate. That's why we've created a Dear World Leaders campaign, which is a campaign that is asking people to submit their messages to Dear World Leaders, to world leaders, so that they can tell them what they want to see. So for years now, we've seen a lot of communicators telling people that they should change their habits, that they should buy locally, that they should reduce plastics, that they should take public transport. And while all of this is important, then we are asking people to do this while big corporations and leaders are not doing enough, quite the opposite. And so we need to be able to, this has created fatigue for people. And so what we want to convey now is you have the power to use your voice to demand change to the people in the positions of power. So that's why we created this initiative, which we created for COP26 last year, and we're bringing to Egypt this year as well. You can check the website, dearworldleaders.org, and we ask people to, related to point number 3, to show us, if they can, what does climate change look like for you in your place, because that is a very powerful narrative when we can see images of what's happening on the ground. And again, to re-emphasize, we need to combine the facts with the stories and with emotions. Following, I wanted to, I wanted to show some stories some examples of what these stories look like. So these are stories that we created from UNDP or UNDP Climate. So this is a little video. So if you can click, Yeah. So this is a story that we did last year on Antigua and Barbuda. This is sort of not focusing on a personal story, but rather on the story of the country, what challenges it's facing, what the people are doing. We're using strong visuals. We're using quotes from representatives, from people. We are giving a sort of a hopeful take on the challenges and the actions. And we are at the end explaining how we, as UNDP Climate Promise, are supporting these efforts. So this is one example. The next one is on a story on Guatemala's indigenous community, which was the Equator Prize winner. It's called Uts Che. And again, it's focused on the voices of these communities, them telling their story on how climate change is affecting them and how they're bringing solutions for which they were awarded. And of course, this is all is reinforced by the visuals, by the strong images that we're using here. And this is placed into the global context and explaining how this relates. How can anyone be related to this story? And at the end, again, we say how Climate Promise is supporting these efforts, but I wanted to make the point here that it's very tempting sometimes to say, you know, okay, this is what we're doing, UNDP is doing that, or this organization is doing that, or this government is doing that, which is important, but it's not what the story is about. And the story, what I heard the other day, something that really resonated with me, is that you have to trust the story and you have to trust the reader to make the connection there. This is just another example of a video format for storytelling. This is a video that we created with colleagues in Dominica and in the region, telling the communities, saying how they are focusing on reforestation and sustainable agriculture to become more resilient to the impacts that climate change is having on them. So I'm going to end with one more slide that just to emphasize that visuals for storytelling is everything, and that to be able to communicate effectively about what's happening, about the work that you're doing on the ground, we need this, and it's important to have into consideration when thinking about how you're going to communicate about this. And that's all. I left at the end a link to our website where you can see more of these examples of content that we are producing and that we are always very happy to create to communicate what you are all doing. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, we can chat later. Happy to talk to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. And if you'd like to talk more storytelling, you can pull Danny aside and have a quick chat. So colleagues, we're now at the final session for today and for the forum, and that would be a Partners Roundtable moderated by Ms. Maxine Welsh, the Climate Promise Manager at the Barbados office. Let me now invite the panelists to please come forward. We have the NDC partnership, Ms. Clarissa Lenny. We also have Irina, who will be joining us online. We have UWI, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the EU delegation in Barbados and the Commonwealth Office. Sorry, I now have the names of of the panelists. So it's Ms. Donna Gittins, delegation of the European Union to the Eastern Caribbean countries, OECS and CARICOM and CARIFORUM. Ms. Sasha Jatan Singh, Commonwealth Finance Access Hub. Ms. Jennifer Dorothy Begara Rodriguez from the Inter-American Development Bank. Mr. Derek Gibbs from the Caribbean Development Bank. Ms. Arietta Rakai from IRENA, and Ms. Clarissa Lenny from the NDC Partnership. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Allow me to take you back to how we started yesterday. We started and we mentioned the pledge that was made almost 7 years ago at the Paris Agreement. At this session, we like to focus on pledge to impact. What are we saying that we're going to do, but how are we going to get there? Because we are speaking, of course, on implementation. And during the sessions yesterday and today, there was some mention of the various aspects needed to support the successful implementation of the NDCs, from finance, from more inclusive approaches. And these are things that we like to discuss with our partners here today, because the reality is the implementation process and even the revision process is a collaborative effort. And with the Climate Promise, we have actually collaborated with a number of organizations and partners to support the work. And this is an opportunity for these partners to give an understanding or an insight into what support countries and other organizations can have in reaching the goals and targets that are set in the NDC. So therefore, this is why this session is entitled From Pledge to Impact. The session today, or this segment actually, will have 3 sections. So first, of course, I'm going to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their organizations, and to speak of their organizations in the context of sustainable development. And for the second session, each panelist, of course, will answer a specific question based on their organization's ability to support the implementation process for the NDCs, and of course, leading to the next revision process of the NDCs. And in this segment, we will have a question and answer session. We are a bit behind schedule because the first session was, of course, quite interactive and informative. And I will first go to Ms. Sasha Jatan Singh, and followed by Ms. Donna Gittins, Ms. Clarissa, and then Mr. Derek Gibbs. So briefly, introduce yourselves and the organizations.
Thank you all. Well, I'm sure you all know who I am, but I'm Sasha Jatan Singh. I'm the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor to Antigua and Barbuda. And I represent the Commonwealth Secretariat, particularly the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. And this hub of CIFA was it was operationalized in 2016, and it's from our Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting mandate from 2015. And the focus of CIFA is to enhance access to and mobilize climate finance for climate action and NDC implementation in Commonwealth member countries, with particular focus on SIDS and least developed countries. So right now we have 16 advisors in country, actually embedded in various countries in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Pacific, and we should have in Asia shortly. So in the sorry about that. In the Caribbean, we actually have advisors in Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, St. Lucia, and Grenada. We're expecting. I'm sorry, I have to actually leave to go on a flight. So this is my taxi. Oh my gosh. I will answer this shortly. But basically, the purpose of the Climate Finance Access Hub is really to look at, is to tailor solutions for climate finance based on the country's priorities. So we're really focused on a country-driven approach to to tailoring the terms of reference for the climate finance advisors. We also focus on embedded actions. That's why the focus of CIFA is to have, long-term experts embedded within a country's, government ministry or department that deals with climate change and finance. So usually it would be either in the, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Economic Development and Finance. Depending on the country, we also focus on partnerships, so building partnerships, regionally, internationally, and how do we leverage the partnerships from across the Commonwealth. So what has been useful is being able to have access to networks and partnerships from other countries and other advisors. So it's not just me working in a silo here in Antigua and Barbuda. I'm able to leverage, my access to experts and access to partners from Africa and from the Pacific as well, in addition to the Commonwealth headquarters in London. So I think that is quite useful, that model. And they call the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access. We operate using a hubs and spokes model. So this is where, we really enable this better, facilitation and of partnerships and collaboration, and also sharing knowledge and best practices and lessons learned across the Commonwealth through the advisors and through the various countries in which we operate. So I think in addition to national advisors, we also have regional advisors. So we have regional advisors for Asia Pacific and for Africa, and we're shortly expecting to have the regional advisor for the Caribbean on board, and they will be based at the CARICOM Secretariat, but we'll be working very closely with the 5Cs to develop more regional approaches to how we access climate finance. And the main, I would say, areas of focus is obviously, project development or proposal development. Then also looking at policy development. So we've supported, for example, Belize in developing their climate finance landscape assessment, as well as their climate finance strategy last year in supporting the NDC revision process. We also support accreditation and reaccreditation as well. So that's what I'm currently supporting Antigua and Barbuda. We're shortly going to go into our reaccreditation for the GCF. Then also we do capacity building and capacity strengthening, if it's institutional or technical capacity, and also definitely knowledge management and learning. So what we're trying to do is share what we've learned from the various modalities and how we operate. So it's quite interesting that the Climate Finance Advisory Network, CFAN, is actually based out of the best practices and so on coming out from the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. And the thing is, climate finance is, it's emerging, and we need various modalities to be able to access new and existing sources of climate finance. So this is just one model, and we're definitely hoping to share and collaborate with other partners in the future. Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Donna Gittins. I am a program manager for the climate change portfolio at the EU delegation in Barbados, which also serves the Eastern Caribbean, OECS, CARICOM, and CARIFORUM. The EU has been privileged to be a long-standing partner with countries in the region towards sustainable development and climate action. This is done through a number of programs that are financed by the organization. We support the financing for the Climate Promise. We have other programs as well, which may not directly say NDC, but they have supported the ambitions that have been outlined in the NDCs of the different countries. These include projects that deal with the energy transition, water security, climate adaptation and climate mitigation, and a number of other initiatives. We usually work with partnering with other implementing agencies. So we work through the UN organizations, we work through the EU member state agencies, and they undertake most of that implementation. We also support technical assistance for countries, either by financing experts to come in and provide support, or by sending experts, bringing in experts from Europe to provide support. We provide a framework for north-south exchanges between Europe and the Caribbean to allow for training of experts in the Caribbean, and for allow experts from Europe to come in and see the context in the Caribbean as well. We allow for south-south cooperation between Caribbean countries that we work through for the different programs to be able to feed into one another and be able to strengthen the action going forward. As well as we do a number of things. As well as provide support for policy frameworks and more concrete actions on the ground. So our hands are in many pies. We support where we can, and we support based on the country's indication of what their key priorities are. All support is done through dialogue with the countries, dialogue at the regional levels, to allow them to indicate what they want to see implemented and to tailor it to the context of the particular sub-region or national application that would be needed for the particular time. So just happy to hear.
Hello? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Clarissa Lena. I'm here from the NDC Partnership Support Unit, which is the secretariat of the NDC Partnership. I should note that even though this is a partner roundtable, the NDC Partnership is not a partner in the traditional sense. Instead, we're a global coalition of developing and developed countries, institutional members, including international financial institutions, and associate members, which are primarily NGOs. I think at the moment we're at about 204 members, but that number keeps ticking up every day, so I could be behind on that now. So the way that we work is really to try to create and deliver ambitious climate action that helps further the goals of both the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. We do that by working with our developing country members to surface requests for support relating to NDC implementation and enhancement, and matchmaking those requests for support to development partners and implementing partners that can most effectively respond with their expertise, with their technical assistance, and also with project financing. I'm going to leave things there for the moment because I know that we're quite pressed for time, but I'm really happy to answer any questions about our model, either via email after this or directly. But I'll pass this along to my colleague now. Thank you.
Good morning. For those who weren't here yesterday, my name is Derek Gibbs. I'm representing the Caribbean Development Bank. And I believe most of you would know what the Caribbean Development Bank, or CDB, what we are doing, what we do in the region. So we are the regional bank, and we have a very clear and strong mandate that speaks to the development, sustainable development of the region. We are working through 19 borrowing member countries, of which we provide various support across various sectors. While directly we don't, how should I say it, finance directly the NDCs, indirectly, we are working with countries within sectors like energy, water, sanitation, and other sectors, of which they are counted as part of the NDCs for the various member countries. So somewhat indirectly, we are supporting NDCs, and we have taken account of the support that we are providing towards these NDCs, and I can speak to that a bit more later. But suffice to say, we are very much interested in supporting the current NDCs, and I know many countries now are, some of the countries are moving towards now the updated NDCs, and also second NDCs, and we are very much interested in providing support to our member countries in those regards. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. I don't want to essentially call this a market, but this is what it is. It's an opportunity for countries to see what is available, essentially to shop around for the various support mechanisms that they need as they continue. I will go first to Ms. Jatan Singh, as we know that she has to leave shortly, to get things rolling. So my question to you is, access to finance for implementation is a critical aspect, and we've been hearing a lot of this over the past sessions, towards achieving all targets, any targets of the NDCs. Can you highlight sectors and or stakeholder groups that should be considered as possible sources of financing for the NDCs?
Thank you for that. And that's an interesting question and quite valid. However, we're always talking about new and additional sources of climate finance, and we're not really addressing, the existing sources of climate finance and looking at it at a more granular level. So what is the quality? What are the existing constraints and limitations to that impede access to climate finance, the existing sources, whether it be multilateral funds, bilateral sources, even the new sources of finance that have been announced, at COP26 and so forth. These new blended funds, such as convergence, and what we're finding is that there are quite a number of limitations for existing funds and existing sources of climate finance that we need to look at and we need to address. So one of the issues that a lot of Caribbean SIDS are facing, like Antigua and Barbuda, is that we're actually not eligible to apply for sources of climate finance due to the fact that we are no longer eligible to receive official development assistance, ODA support. And that's a real constraint for SIDS and for developing countries, because we now have to look at what are the criteria, the eligibility criteria, considering that now, why is it that donors and investors are making this distinction? Because we're now blurring the lines of what is climate finance and what is development assistance. Climate finance is not development assistance, and you cannot impose limitations on sources of climate finance, especially for the most vulnerable countries such as SIDS. And in addition to the fact that we do need new additional adequate quality sources of climate finance, we have to look at the existing sources and what are the limitations to SIDS and to LDCs and so on in accessing what exists. Because once we know this and once we're able to look at these are the issues, we can now help tailor the solutions for any new and upcoming sources of funds. For example, there was a recent announcement from the CIF, the Climate Investment Funds, for their program on people, nature, and climate. The call for proposals is August 1st. This is fantastic for Antigua and Barbuda. It actually meets a lot of our updated NDCs. Unfortunately, the eligibility criteria is that only OD eligible countries can apply for this, right? And I think we have to have that discussion first, and then we're able to now look at additional and potential investors, if it's different sectors, private sector, insurance companies, commercial banks, also looking at philanthropic organizations. So we need to really understand what climate finance should mean for Caribbean SIDS and also do some sort of investor or donor analysis and mapping for us to better understand what our needs are and how they could best meet those needs. Instead of us only looking for new sources, we need to know where we are right now and how we could improve. So if you have any additional questions related to that, my colleague Nadia could also could answer quite well. She is our board member for SIDS on the GCF board. So I just want to say thank you all so much for inviting me to be on this investor or donor roundtable, partner roundtable, sorry. And I really do appreciate being part of this forum. I think it was a fantastic 2 days, and I look forward to liaising with all of you in the future. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Sasha. It's sad to see you go, but sorry. A round of applause for Sasha, please. Thank you. As she rushes to get her taxi. I would say, though, I'm sure most of you already know, but a report will be developed after the forum. And of course, we'll be including the names of all our panelists. So you can have an opportunity to reach out to them for any additional questions or support that you would need. Sasha, before you go, can you please point out to your colleagues so we know who to ask our questions, to whom we direct our questions. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge one of our online partners, Ms. Jennifer Bagara Rodriguez from the IADP. You can spotlight her, please, to give her an opportunity to introduce herself and her organization in the context of adaptation and sustainable development.
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
are you with
sorry
us?
I had to join online. Yesterday we had a couple of issues when I was turning on the video, so please allow me to not put it on today so we can at least have my audio. So yes, I'm Jennifer Doherty Bigara. I am the Senior Climate Change Specialist of the Inter-American Development Bank here in Barbados. What we do is basically mainstream climate change considerations in all our loans, but also technical cooperations. One of these technical cooperations, for example, allowed us to support Barbados in the update of their NDC, which was submitted to the UNFCCC last year. And next year, we will be ensuring that all our operations are Paris aligned. So in that sense, this is how we are working with the region and very much looking forward to also provide additional support in cutting edge areas. As we know, climate change needs to be translated into different sectors, themes, topics. So that is what we are trying to do, especially for the Caribbean, where, as we were mentioning yesterday, there is a lack of data, and sometimes that lack of data has limited the generation of knowledge for this region. So this is what we're doing, and I'm happy to be here with you, even if it is online.
Thank you, Jennifer, and happy to have you with us. So actually, this next question is directed both to Jennifer and to Derek Gibbs. What would you describe are possible responsibilities or roles that regional financial institutions and entities have in ensuring that there are opportunities to finance implementation? Now, there are two aspects to pass to this question. So we'll give you an opportunity to address this first part. So I'll repeat it. What would you describe are possible possibilities or roles that regional financial institutions and entities have in ensuring that there are opportunities to finance implementation? I would invite Derek to go first.
Okay, so thanks for the question. As I indicated, I believe yesterday, and I might have alluded to it just now, that CDB, we're in the business of mobilizing financing, particularly concessional financing, because we recognize there's a great need by our BMCs for financing for the climate actions. So let me just share with you some quick statistics. Because what we have been doing within CDB, we have been working to track our funding within CDB, and this is our own funding within CDB, as to what it is that we are spending as it relates to climate actions. So between 2017 and 2022, I can report that we have been able to track spending over 200 million US dollars. And that would have gone towards climate actions, that being adaptation and mitigation. And we've been doing this tracking following the MDB methodology that you may have heard about. We have adopted the position that we need to better understand how the resources are flowing from CDB to our BMCs, not only as it relates to adaptation and mitigation, but breaking that down a bit more, looking at the various sectors within which we are operating. And so much of those funds have gone towards energy, and energy, as you know, is a big part of the NDCs. So when we talk about energy, we're talking about both renewable energy and energy efficiency. Also, a large part of CDB's funding has gone towards adaptation. So we're talking about building adaptation within infrastructure. We're talking about water projects. We're talking about agriculture. We're also operating across the BMCs with what we call policy-based loans. And these type of loans are more policy focused, but a large part of that relates to prior actions for climate change. And we're also operating within disaster risk reduction. Within CDB, we've been able to, as I indicated, work through loans. We'll also be able to work through grants. We're providing a significant amount of grants. We have a pool of funds, which we call the special development funds, for which we can provide very low costs to our BMCs. And we're also providing, as I indicated, these policy-based loans to our member countries. So we are also working with various partners, because we realize that CDB alone will not have the resources really to do the amount of work that is needed across the region. So we're partnering with other donors, like the European Investment Bank. We're working through a program called CALT, of which we're providing concessionary financing and also grants. We're working with the EU. We recently started a new program called the CARE program, 40 million euros, where we'll be working across communities to help build climate resilience into those communities. We're also working with the GCF. Currently, we have 2 programs that we're developing with the GCF, and hopefully we will be able to tap into the highly concessionary resources of the GCF. We think at least $150 million across those 2 programs, of which those resources then would be linked to, for example, in one of the programs where we are working with DFIs. So it'll be linked to DFIs to then to be unlinked to the across the private sector for climate actions. We're also working with the Adaptation Fund. We've been able to get a sizable grant for St. Lucia to build resilience within the agriculture sector. And we also have a pool of resources specifically for energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. These are the SEEK resources and the SIF resources. And many of our countries already tap into those resources. And also I should mention the UK, which we are working with the UK government, with the UK SIF program, of which we are building, providing construction resources, along with also grants to build climate resilience into infrastructure. So I'm saying all of that to say finally that, we're working with partners because we realize, as I said, we need to work with others in order to mobilize resources, but we also set ourselves a target of 25 to 30% of our own funds to go towards climate actions. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. And I do appreciate the way you ended in saying that is working with partners, because again, it is a collaborative process. And speaking on the mobilization of finance, the Climate Promise, in collaboration with the Engender Project, actually did some work in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, looking at the scoping of the private sector for just that to mobilize finance for NDC implementation. And with that, I would like to direct the second aspect of this question to Jennifer online, because yes, we would like to look at what other elements, just as Sasha mentioned before she left, are actually existing in terms of finding the finance to support implementation. But speaking on an enabling environment, what aspects you would say, Jennifer, are needed to support the creation of an enabling environment, either locally within your country or regionally, that encourages the increased involvement of financial institutions and the private sector in NDC implementation?
Yes, well, basically one of our biggest instruments is, and it was just mentioned by Derek, is the policy-based loans. The policy-based loans allow us to really change things, foster reforms, assess what needs to be done to change the actual institutional frameworks, and really ensure that they're aligned to the NDCs. We also have a very specific division, the Capital Markets Division, which would be able to provide credit lines, and those credit lines would have to be aligned to the NDC. So for us, it is important to always have the NDC as a guiding document. And that's also why we try to ensure that NDCs can be as specific as possible. For example, when they have indicators, we can align the different loans we have with each of the governments to the NDC targets. So for example, when a country has some specific targets on renewable energy, energy efficiency, but also even in resilience, we try to ensure how to align the loan to the specific NDC document. So this has been quite an interesting exercise, because it is still sadly a reality that sectors do not kind of integrate the NDC as a master document when they plan for investments. So in that sense, we've tried to do our best to really align these, and this will become much more kind of adamant as we move to a Paris-aligned portfolio, is to ensure that not only looking at the climate finance figures will be important, but also ensuring that whatever project we do is not contradicting the pathway we should all aim for successful Paris Agreement. So in that sense, we're also doing a lot of training, because most of our financial institutions in the region are still trying to understand and grasp what it is to be NDC aligned or even climate change friendly. I'm using the word friendly because it is kind of an incipient kind of movement. And of course, they're very much moving fast with ESG standards, but it is important for us that they do also understand what it means, for example, to include risk considerations and considerations into their portfolios, how they would need to have specific text to enhance resilience, and what does it mean. But also, as I was mentioning yesterday, one thing is to support the offer of financial partners, but we also need to educate the demand. And that is also very important, because we can create as many credit lines as we want to, but if there is no one on the other side to request them, there is no impact on what can be done. So this has happened in the past in many Latin American countries, and we're trying our best to not have the same obstacles in the Caribbean region.
Okay. Thank you for that input, Jennifer. And just to identify one point you mentioned, where a lot of financial institutions are not sure of what it means regarding their input in climate action and climate change. And that begs the discussion on the need to perhaps start looking at climate proofing, I would say, a lot of our financial institutions, so that they are more able to provide support in that aspect. My next question is to Ms. Donna Gittins. The next NDC revision process, the next NDC revision process is expected to take place within the next 2 to 3 years. And at that point, countries are expected again to show even more ambition with that iteration of their NDCs. How are examples of and tools for successful implementation being made available to countries in the region? I think you may have touched on that a bit with your opening, but what examples are there that countries can access regarding successful implementation, larger countries that they can utilize for the next iteration?
Thank you for the question, Maxine. Yes, we do realize that the countries will be required to be more ambitious going forward. The IPCC report certainly suggests and supports the increasing ambition of countries as it relates to their climate actions. And the European Union stands ready to support countries in that particular area. How do we bring examples? So, recently we announced the European Green Deal was announced, and the European Green Deal, while it is a domestic policy framework, forms the basis on which we collaborate and partner with countries that we work with. So this is very much aligned to the tenets of the Paris Agreement, and it supports the external actions of the European Union. Everything is filtered through that. But it is understandable that while it supports common action on the European continent, it supports adaptation measures and all the attending policies that have come out of that deal, that the intention is not to replicate that in its entirety in any region. There's an understanding that each region has its own unique circumstance, each country has its own unique circumstance, and where you can take the principles of the European Green Deal and apply them, that can be applied. But certainly they will be adapted to suit the specific regional and country context. One of the things that will be pulled is the need or the use of targeted dialogue with governments and countries to determine priority areas for action, and to determine the best ways in which to implement those actions so that they're properly tailored to meet the unique needs. Secondly, as part of our development cooperation, it's actually called Partnership for a Caribbean Green Deal. That supports the shared ambitions between the EU, member states and the EU as an organization, and the Caribbean ambitions. There are quite a few areas of similarity and quite a few, as there have always been between the two, that support the long-standing cooperation that we've had in the region. But particularly for supporting a partnership towards a Caribbean Green Deal, the main vehicle for this would be one of our EU flagship projects called Euroclima, which is a way of doing work. This has been implemented in Latin America since 2011, and successfully so. It started as a vehicle to support policy and legislative frameworks and to strengthen those, and has eventually evolved to support a more integrated and consultative process towards actual climate action. And so that is going to be expanded into the Caribbean region to bring those same principles that have been aligned to Latin America, albeit very much adapted to suit the very unique circumstances in the Caribbean, because I know there's a long-standing angst that we are often lumped with Latin America and not seen. So that has been seen and that has been heard. So the Euroclima Caribbean will be very much tailored to suit the unique cultural and site-specific context of the Caribbean region. And it's through this vehicle that we will be supporting adaptation and mitigation actions. And through this vehicle that we'll be using examples that have worked in Latin America, the principles of the Green Deal that have worked in countries in Europe, and adapting them to be able to apply them to countries in the Caribbean to best push them forward around the sustainable development pathway. Euroclima is supposed to be a very flexible approach, so it doesn't come with any prescribed development actions per se. It starts with a policy dialogue. The policy dialogue with each of the countries will determine what the priorities are. Based on those priority, conversations will continue to happen with the partners that we are going to be working with, one of which is UNDP. I'll be also working with GIZ and Expertise France to support implementation on the ground, where any actions crafted on the Euroclima will be based strictly on the dialogues that have been had with the countries. So right now, there are no prescribed actions. Those actions are to be determined based on what comes out of the policy dialogue. Under the program, it will support strengthening of policy frameworks, but really the bulk of the support will be for implementation of actual action, and two, to support countries to strengthen their investment and business frameworks, to upscale those actions and to match those actions with other donors or with investment opportunities so that it can be upscaled and move forward in a way that is more meaningful for the country. I don't know if I've gone past your question. More meaningful for the country. So yes, basically that's it. We also adopted, because there's similarities in the legislative framework and the way of working between the EU and the OECS. Those similarities are used in defining actions. There are also opportunity. We do share experiences through, like I said before, North-South cooperation, the bringing of experts here, the carrying of experts from the Caribbean to Europe to see new technologies, new way of applying things, and for experts to come from Europe here to see how things are done. The Caribbean is quite resilient, very unique ways of doing things, and there are things to be learned on either side. But mainly through the Euroclima approach, that's how we will be showing how different approaches that have worked in Latin America and Caribbean can be utilized in this region, and tailoring those based on the country dialogue for really targeted actions.
Thank you, Donna. And actually, that last part there, I'm sure that many of our colleagues in the room and those of us and those online are happy to hear the aspect of this. While there are lessons learned that can be utilized, that there is a focus on ensuring that they are tailored, because we do understand the angst that there is, where there are examples that come in and they are expected to just fit into our region without understanding the Caribbean context or the region or the country context. That is something that I think is important, that is put out there, and our colleagues are able to understand that they do have this opportunity to gain this support, but being ensured that the support that will be gained will be tailored to fit their specific country and regional context. So many thanks for that input. My final question would be to Clarissa. The NDC partnership has been a critical entity throughout the revision process in many countries. What are some key lessons learned throughout this revision process, and how will these be addressed going forward? And what support can countries expect from the partnership in the monitoring and tracking of the progress toward the NDCs? Because of course, when it comes around to the next time, there will be a look back, know what has been done, what has the progress been like to get to the next iteration. So just some input from you on that aspect, please.
Thanks, Maxine. And let me just take the opportunity to thank Donna also for that intervention. Euroclima Plus has been a really helpful, valuable partner in the Latin American context, so it's really encouraging from our side also to hear that they're getting more involved in the Caribbean. So in response to the first part of your question, Maxine, about NDC enhancement, as undoubtedly a lot of people in this room know, the NDC partnership launched the Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP, in 2019 to support developing countries to update their NDCs for the 2020 and ultimately 2021 enhancement cycle. Through that program, we mobilized approximately 55 million to support 67 developing countries to update the ambition, quality, and process underlying their NDCs. And a recent report or assessment to look back on that process found that all of the countries supported saw improvements on those three metrics. So again, on the ambition of their NDCs, on the quality, the technical knowledge underlying the commitments that they were making, and also on the process behind them. So to what extent were they engaging key stakeholders and making sure that this was really a whole of society product that was ultimately being submitted. So obviously what we've heard loud and clear from our members, and I should emphasize that the partnership is 100% a country-driven process, so we really try to respond primarily to the needs that we're hearing from our developing country members, is that they want to focus on implementation. They've spent the last couple of years working on enhancement. Everyone's a bit exhausted by this, and their primary focus at the moment is implementation. So to that end, at the moment, we've been supporting resource mobilization towards existing implementation plans, updating those implementation plans to reflect enhanced NDCs, developing financing strategies, as for example in Antigua and Barbuda, to concretize some of the projects and programs that will be supporting the implementation of those plans. So this is some of the work that we're doing in this area at the moment. But in terms of looking ahead to the 2025 cycle, we are trying to capitalize on some of the learning that we did in the previous round. So we're in the process of launching CAP 2.0. The first portion of that for the next couple of months will be focused on supporting countries to either develop or start operationalizing their long-term strategies, or LT-LEDs. But in 2023, we will be looking already at NDC enhancement. And the idea behind that is to really make sure that we're starting early so that we can engage the right people in those processes, and ideally also take advantage of the institutional frameworks that were already developed during the previous enhancement cycle. So we're not starting from square one. Hopefully we can hit the ground running and really make sure that this is an iterative process this time around. In terms of your question on monitoring and tracking. So from the beginning of the partnership's time, I think we're now entering our 6th year, we've gotten a lot of requests related to MRV and now ETF compliance, so that's the Enhanced Transparency Framework. So that's specifically for monitoring progress towards implementing the Paris Agreement. More specifically, in terms of monitoring implementation of NDC implementation plans, for example, the partnership has something it calls its online partnership plan tool, where countries can upload their implementation plans and update them in real time. So this is open to the public, so it's also something that facilitates transparency, so that countries can actively report to people in country and outside of the country on what they're currently doing on those implementation plans. It also allows partners to input information regarding the support that they're providing to those plans directly onto that online platform. And we found that it's a really powerful tool for tracking projects in real time and also identifying any existing support gaps so that we can proactively mobilize resources to plug those holes. I'll leave it there for the moment, but happy to take any follow-up questions on that.
Thank you to all our panelists for their answer to this question in this section. And that actually brings it to the end of this segment. And we're now opening the floor for questions from our audience, either here with us in this room or typed questions from members of the online forum. Just a reminder that in the absence of Sasha, we have a question over there. Of Sasha, we have Ms. Nadia Spencer-Henry. Yes, to provide support, answers to questions from the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. I'd also like to acknowledge academia because, of course, in the collaborative process, it's not just donors, it's not just seeking finance, but we do work with members of academia. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Karen Murdoch here with us today representing the UE 5 Islands campus. The UWI has, of course, been a critical partner in the not just the revision process, but also going forward towards, as we have been mentioning over and over, towards the elements of implementation. So I see that we have one question over there. Can you raise your hand, please?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and to the presenters as well. My question is actually to the lady who left or to her representative who is expected to respond to the questions. So my question is, having identified the country's eligibility from a governmental perspective, to what extent, if any, does their data management or other technological process help them to identify NGOs who have the necessary governance structures in place that can be eligible for certain grants? Thank you.
I'd like to invite Nadia to join us on up here, since some questions will be directed to you.
Sorry about that. So first, answering in terms of the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, their support is specifically to the government. And so the support that they provide assists the government with the plans that the government has put in place. So the intention is that the climate finance advisor that you do take on helps you to implement the plan that you want. So their advice is fit for purpose. So if there is an NGO that the government desires to work with, or is desirous of ungranting funds to, then this will be incorporated into the work that the climate finance advisor does. So they would not generally come into a country and look for that work to be done. They come with a plan in place based on what the government has asked them to do in terms of providing fit for purpose climate finance.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Do we have any additional questions from the colleagues? Yep.
Thanks, colleagues. Just a quick question from my side. I've heard about the partnerships. Is there a donor coordination group where you come together and look at country or regional specific plans?
We invite any one of our panelists to answer this question.
A formal group, not to my knowledge, except through the ECDPG, and I don't know if that would count for the purposes of your question. I can speak to your klima and say that everything that will be done under this mechanism will be done in consultation with the donors already at work in the region. The intention is not to reinvent the wheel or to duplicate efforts. And done in collaboration with in discussion with the regional agencies, including 5Cs, to ensure that we are connected to the right partners who are already at work in the region, to ensure that there's complementarity and that we can build on actions that have already happened and to maximize resources that are available. So in the formal sense, there's space under Euroclima to support continuous donor dialogue to ensure that we are updated on ongoing actions and can maximize what is being done for the benefit of the country and to meet the priorities that have been identified.
Maybe just to add quickly from the NDC partnership side, so wanting to avoid duplication was the primary reason the partnership was set up. The idea behind circulating requests from countries to all members of the partnership is to make sure that they're all aware of what's being surfaced and what work partners might already be doing in country. At the country level, so not the regional level, we have supported setting up coordination mechanisms between various donors and implementing partners. That's been quite successful in several countries in the Caribbean specifically. At the regional level, we do our best to coordinate with partners like UNDP with more or less success as the case may be, but it's definitely something that we're working on. But as I said, the intent is always to try to prevent duplication and increase synergies through as much transparency as possible. Thank you.
Just to speak on behalf of the GCF, since I also represent them. So generally, when you present a project for financing to the Green Climate Fund, you are required to speak about any other donor that is financing your particular project or program so that there is not duplication in that sense. So there's no formal what you would call a donor meeting as you would do when you have a development program that you put out for a donor engagement per se, but you do have the opportunity to declare and to point out where your counter financing will be coming from when you put a project or program in place. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry again. Thanks to all of those wonderful responses. Just as a quick follow-up, I think throughout the 2 days we have heard about capacity constraints. And I'm not making a plug here for 5Cs, okay? But donors are known to provide funding for programs, but not institutional strengthening. How are we necessarily examining that particular impediment which we are always faced with, and we continue to speak about the implementation gap to ensure that we're not only unlocking, but we are also able to move the funds. Mm-hmm. That's the end of it. Thanks.
Would you like to respond? Okay. Carissa, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So what I can say from the NDC partnership perspective is that we have supported embedding advisors in a number of different entities. So that can be at the sectoral level. Recently, I know that, for example, in Jamaica, we've supported embedding an energy advisor in the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, and that's specifically to address what you're talking about in terms of capacity constraints. More broadly, we also support embedding in-country facilitators to support the kind of donor coordination that you were talking about previously and mobilizing resources towards NDC implementation and enhancement. We've also supported embedding climate finance advisors of like Sasha, who was just on the panel just now, although she's been deployed through Commonwealth. So we're acutely aware of this need, and I think that this is absolutely something that we see as part of our mandate.
Yeah, I wasn't going to respond, but I think I should. One of the reasons that we suffer from that particular challenge goes back to our own institutional arrangements, so that countries have to be prepared to accept the whether it is technical assistance or the financing that they're going to be receiving. So putting the necessary institutional capacity in place. So you may not have a Ministry of Finance with 50 persons that are looking at climate finance, or a DOE that has 100 persons, but you can combine and share resources. In the Ministry of Finance where I work, we collaborate very well with the DOE, and that is one of the reasons why the DOE has been able to onboard a lot of the climate finance that they have been able to, because we are able to then run it through the budgetary channels. There's clear transparency of how the funding is going to be used, how we're going to be able to pull in different sectors, how we're going to be able to account for gender if necessary, vulnerable groups, etc. But if we continue to operate in silos that you spoke about before, Doc, you spoke about it as well. If we continue to operate that way, then we will find ourselves in a position where we're not able to implement or to be able to fully utilize the financing that is coming our way. For example, let me speak on behalf of the GCF again. The GCF provides readiness funding to all accredited entities every year. And this readiness funding is basically to be used by the country to help it to build capacity. If the country is not using that funding to develop its own capacity, then we will always find ourselves in a way where we're not able to fully implement and to use the financing that is coming to us. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to address the question from the point of view of CDB. We work quite closely with 5Cs, but for CDB, in terms of all lending program, we do realize the capacity constraints, and to address that, on many occasions, what we try to do, we try to build in technical assistance within our lending programs that would speak to the challenges that the countries may have, particularly as it relates to implementation. We also try to work quite closely with the countries. So communication is of great importance, and try at least to hold the hands of the countries and to walk them through the process. So we try to adopt a multiple approach in terms of our lending and ensuring that we can disburse as quickly as possible.
Thank you for that, Derek. I think Ms. Gittins also has some inputs.
Yeah, just to round off the conversation, in many of the EU-funded programs, technical assistance is built in as well to support implementation. And under Euroclima Caribbean, we recognize the capacity issues that have plagued countries in the Caribbean, and not means capacity in terms of expertise, but capacity in terms of numbers. And that has been built into the program to allow for us to liaise with member state agencies who are able to provide experts if they can be embedded into countries, depending on what is the outcome of the policy dialogue and the actions that will be implemented in the country or at the regional level.
Thank you for that, Ms. Gittins. I do believe we have some additional questions from our audience.
Yeah, not really a question, just a comment and maybe a bit of background information for Ms. Wong in terms of climate financing and selection of stakeholders. I know at least for the DOE, it does depend on the project outputs, and the targeted stakeholders. So, for example, the SLIM project may be looking at the transport sector and figuring out how to get climate financing to that specific sector. So it does somewhat depend, and I believe Melissa is here, it does somewhat depend on the specific project that we're looking at getting the financing through. So just wanted to make that small piece of input.
Thank you for that. And just for reference, the DOE refers to the Department of Environment and Ministry of Health, Wellness, and the Environment, Antigua? That's correct, so just for reference. And I saw another hand up, Fernando.
Thank you. Just probably to complement a little bit of what the panelists have said regarding the previous question on coordination platforms and the institutionality that is needed. Well, from the UN system, not UNDP, but the UN system, we do have a proper coordination platform, which is at regional level. It's called the Issue-Based Coalition for Climate Change, where all UN agencies comes together and try to identify what are the pressing issues on climate change and how can we avoid this duplication of efforts. However, this is UN system owned, and of course it would be great if we could have or expand this kind of coordination. Nevertheless, from the UNDP approach and the climate partners approach is that these coordination platforms needs to be owned by the countries. It's not something that we need to do regionally. It's something that the countries needs to do by themselves. There's a need of this ownership that provides this whole of government approach. And we have been providing this support to several countries in the region to develop or enhance their national climate change coordination platforms, where the governments come together from a multi-sectoral approach and identify what are their needs, what are the most pressing issues, and how they can bring together donors, how they can bring together private sector, and how they can bring together civil society. So we believe that this is like a good way to avoid this, let's say, standalone approach of having a project or a program or a person that supports these efforts, but rather having an institution that is aware, or a government that is aware that all their entities and institutions needs to come together when talking about climate change and addressing those issues.
Thank you for that, Fernando. I believe that was our last question. And with that, I would like to thank all our panelists for their discussions this morning and the information that was shared. And of course, I am sure that this is valuable information for those of us present in the room and those online as we move forward. I will also hand over to the moderator as we now move to the closing section of the closing remarks for our event.
Okay, so we are at the end of the forum, colleagues, but before we start with the closing remarks, I would like to indulge your patience again in facilitating a group photo. So if you can just come to the front of the room. I know we did this yesterday, but it's a new day. It's a new photo. So if you could just come to the front of the room towards the stage, tall people to the back, short people to the front. And your marker would be the two edges of the stage. So nobody past that left side, nobody past this right side. So you can just have everybody come up quickly. Also, a bit of housekeeping. If you came in this morning and you did not sign in, please do so at the desk with Astrid and Melissa. on your way out to lunch. So right now we'll just, everybody can come up and we can take the photo quickly before we start with the closing remarks. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, so as we close, I would like to invite Minister Cozier Frederick to please come forward to provide us with some brief closing remarks on behalf of the government of the Commonwealth of Dominica.
Good afternoon, fellow Caribbean citizens. I'm happy to be here in Wadadli. It's actually an indigenous name for Antigua. And I will tell you sometime in the future the name of all your Caribbean countries in indigenous name. But to say I'm happy to be here to participate in this wonderful conversation. What is most interesting for me is to listen from the perspective of a policy maker. We are tasked with a lot, and we have to lean heavily on you, from civil society, from the NGOs, and also from the private sector. And I suspect we may not have done good enough to understand the intricacies of your roles and responsibilities as it relates to climate change. So I'm hoping that I could add some value to the conversation, especially as we go into COTED tomorrow. We have other conversations at the ministerial level, and I would want you to endorse my message to my fellow colleagues at the policy level to truly understand the importance of your roles and your responsibilities. And to say, coming from the nature island, coming from an island that has been devastated by numerous weather events in recent history, I'm excited to be part and parcel of policy as we move forward to be the first climate resilient country. But we are not doing this in isolation. We are doing this based on the conversations that we've been having. And one of those we have here today, which is so important, because like we see throughout the region, we have unique island situations, but also we do have common threads that affect all of us. And so it is important that we all understand this. And while we struggle internally to understand the intricacies of our own island states, it is also important to marry what exists in other jurisdictions. So I'm happy to be here. So I'm delighted because the indigenous piece is important. Also the gender piece is also important. And the marrying of the public and private sector is also crucial. And so I really want to lean heavily on your expertise moving forward, and to inform what we do back home, and also what other jurisdictions are attempting to do, as we more especially move forward with our NDCs. In the case of Dominica, we have a very ambitious NDC. We do look at all of the pillars: adaptation, mitigation, resilience. But we know for a fact that we have limitations, and the limitations hinges on access to finance, technology transfer, and also just being a small island state with all of those weather events hitting our shores every now and again. So I'm delighted for the invite and to really, in our local palace, big up the UNDP and for their leadership in all of this. I think it's important. Last year at our independence celebrations, we did celebrate the importance of the UNDP, and they would have received one of our highest national awards on Dominica. It speaks to the partnerships we've been having at the UN level, and it speaks also to our country's seriousness in building resilience and in building the human capacity. And so I'm excited to be on this wonderful island and to really listen to you folks here as you engage yourselves and engage policymakers in a conversation I think is so important for Caribbean civilization. So while we do have our separate jurisdictions, it is important to pull out of it what is it that can truly affect change across the Caribbean region. And so I'm excited that that we could do this as a Caribbean team, and we could do this within the framework of a situation where we do have to fight a lot to garner the resources we need. But I think the will is there. The youth are on board. I'm excited about the youth piece today. And I think that the next generation will be happy for it if we do take on some serious decisions and move beyond the parameters of talks and consultations and to put our ideas into some positive actions. And so really I want to say to you that I think we're on the right trajectory, and it can only augur well for our institutions, both public and private, to lean on our expertise and to be able to share a common narrative that in the end will augur well for our Caribbean civilization. I want to thank you so much for welcoming UNDP and the team here, and also for the warm folks around the table who have expressed, in my view, a very candid perspective on the Caribbean situation and also the island situation. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Minister Frederick. Colleagues, I would like to invite Mr. Fernando Andrade on behalf of UNDP to give some closing remarks and wrap up the session.
Thank you very much. I promise I'll be very, very quick. I think that very important and pressing issues have been discussed here, and we have talked about different sectoral problems and needs that we have, and we have gone from the need of financing. We have talked about energy security. We have gone through cross-cutting issues like gender, local communities, and indigenous, and we have talked about youth. But I think that along all that has been discussed here today, it's important to understand that we have identified that those needs, those issues, those problems are more common than we thought at the beginning, probably. So I think that it's important, and I would like to highlight something that the Minister Frederick just said, it's to share this common narrative. And also something that came out during the discussions, that regionality, it's important to move forward. You know the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you need to go together. So I think that the Caribbean region has a great potential of going very, very far and going together. So in this sense, I believe that this forum may work as a way to start or initiate these conversations that we need to have to each other, to understand that these problems are common, but the solutions may be found together. So these kind of forums may work as the way to start this conversation that needs to happen between countries. And UNDP is ready to provide that support. We're ready to be that bridge of communication between countries and also with partners. We have seen partners, donors sitting here in the same table sharing, and we acknowledge that we need to communicate better. So we are, as UNDP in the Caribbean region, we are ready to provide that support. And please count on us on this. And I would like to thank you all for coming here, for your patience, for your time, but especially for your enthusiasm and that shared responsibility and that shared impetus for fighting climate change together. So thank you very much again, and please help us, and we will help you to bring all the Caribbean together and find solutions together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. So colleagues, we're at the end of the forum. Thank you so much for attending.